recognized for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My amendment, if adopted, will help ensure that this committee is at least honest with the American people about what the real impacts of what this budget will be, both on our national economy and in the neighborhoods we all represent. And Mr. Chairman, you and I have a good relationship. I have a good relationship with Mr. Obernolte. Just to address your point, Mr. Obernolte, if I ever come off as being personal about this, I hope you'll come address me directly, because that's not my intention. My intention is to express a vigorous disagreement about the policy before us here. Because one thing we do agree on is, even if we don't fix this country's borrowing problem, if we don't fix the country's borrowing problem, it will be our kids and their kids who pay the real price for it. It's been reported by several news outlets that a few conservative members of this committee have serious concerns about the budget and what it will ultimately cost American taxpayers in the long run, and I think they're right to be worried about that. The problem is that many are saying that this budget is not bad on paper because President Trump is going to make the economy boom. Specifically, the Republican budget assumes nearly 3% sustained growth over the entire next decade. That's nonsense. The economy is not going to grow at 3% for 10 straight years. In reality, the Congressional Budget Office says growth will be 1.8% annually. And in the last 25 years, real GDP growth has exceeded 3% only 4 times. There's no legitimate evidence to back up the assumption that our economy will grow at 3%, but this gimmick makes up more than $3 trillion in fake deficit reduction in this budget. Republicans are trying to paper over that fact that their agenda will cost America much more than we can afford. Back in 2017, Republicans gave themselves a similar fantasy. It was a budget gimmick then, and it's a budget gimmick now. They'll point to and they have pointed to the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and say that revenues went up despite the tax cuts. That argument is deceptive, because whether or not the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act became law, revenues were projected to go up annually anyway. And while it's true that actual revenue since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was roughly $1.5 trillion more than CBO projected when the bill was passed, the vast majority of that $1.5 trillion was driven by inflation. The rest was caused by COVID response. If you remove the pandemic from the equation, the data shows that our country actually lost about $100 billion to the TCJA. Tax cuts don't pay for themselves, and they never have. Massive cuts to vital programs hurt American families and often prevent economic growth. The budget includes about $4.8 trillion in deficit increases and only partially offsets all that borrowing with what they are calling $1.5 trillion of mandatory savings. As I said at the beginning, a budget is about choices. This budget chooses to direct our tax committee to increase the national debt by $4.8 trillion. A different choice would be to allow the TCJA to expire and save $4.8 trillion. And it's not either or, because we could choose to preserve the less expensive parts that help the middle class, like the child tax credit enhancement, while we allow rates to go back up for people who can best afford to pay our national expenses. And don't tell me that it's going to be that much of a hardship on many people, including many of us, to go from 37 to 39% marginal tax rate. That is not going to break the economy. The budget only offsets the costs of preserving the tax cuts, by the way. It does not address the fact, and does not offset, that the government is borrowing almost $2 trillion every year just to pay our expenses. For all the talk about a mandate the Republicans got the House, the Senate, and the White House, and for all the talk about the need to curb deficits, this Republican budget chooses to continue the practice of borrowing to pay our expenses. All the cuts are designed to offset the deficit we're instructing the Ways and Means Committee to increase. So I've heard, as a Democrat, I just want to perpetuate the status quo, but members of this committee know better. I've been leading bipartisan efforts to address the debt. I've not been shy about talking about cuts or taxes or even the impending insolvency of Social Security and Medicare, and I'm ready to work on that in a bipartisan way. But this budget chooses to be partisan and Republican only. I've also heard about how President Clinton and Speaker Gingrich worked together to balance the budget last time, and that was great. But that deal was that way they would do as much tax increases as they did spending cuts. It was half and half. We could choose that path, but this budget does not. Instead of more revenue, we choose less revenue, and then we pat ourselves on the back for running more like a business, as if a business doesn't understand you both have to control costs and make money. That's common sense. And the problem is made worse because instead of relying on the growth and revenue assumptions from the CBO and nonpartisan groups, we're choosing to pretend. Our mothers taught us to pray for the best and plan for the worst, and we are choosing to ignore that prudent advice. What this means is that we will not just cut the fat, but the bone. When the Republicans say mandatory savings, for instance, they mean destroying programs like Medicaid, which supports critical health care for children, Americans with disabilities, and working people who are already struggling to keep up in this economy. Right now, hospitals across my district in San Diego are fighting a flu epidemic. In the last 9 weeks, patient visits for RSV, flu A, and flu B have quadrupled. Reductions in Medicaid funding, let alone draconian cuts that the Republican budget will require, they say it won't, they say it's not necessary, but that's where we're headed, will have a ripple effect on our health system's ability to respond during surges of seasonal illnesses. With more than 24 million cases and already 13,000 deaths from flu this year, according to CDC, the last thing we need is to slash funding for hospitals and clinics that are saving lives all across the country. But maybe you still think that slashing Medicaid is great policy. And even if you think these cuts are awesome, the math problem with this Republican budget is this: $4.8 trillion in new borrowing minus $1.5 trillion in spending cuts still equals $3.3 trillion in new government debt and deficit. And if our fantasy growth dreams don't come true, the math problem will be worse. The House Republicans want their president's tax cuts so bad they're willing to strip our health system for parts, but you can't make the math work. So we're not decreasing the deficit, we're choosing to explode it. According to an analysis conducted by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, passing this budget would increase the debt to nearly 126% of the size of our economy. That would be the largest our national debt has ever been relative to the size of the economy overall. The actual impact of this budget is more likely to be a recession, with millions of Americans losing their health care, sky-high inflation, higher interest rates, and unemployment. And for all the righteous talk about low tax rates, our kids are going to pay the cost of this debt. We are choosing a darker, more tax-burdened future for our children. So let's not fool ourselves. Let's at least use reliable growth forecasts. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. And yield back.
Gentleman yields. Is there a member who would like to claim the time in opposition to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Klein is recognized for 7 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and I thank the gentleman, my friend from California, for his comments. I'm not going to focus on his contention that somehow that we need to let the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax cuts, which actually spurred economic growth, to expire, or portions of it to expire, or which portions to expire. I'm not going to address the contention that the issue of deficits over the last several years, the cause of those deficits was largely due to Democrat-controlled House, Democrat-controlled Senate, and a Democrat White House. What I want to focus on is the gentleman's contention that we have faulty growth projections. In actuality, the faulty growth projections they lie with the CBO. The macroeconomic feedback effect in the budget is justified by the performance of the economy following the passage of the TCJA in 2017. Prior to the Act's passage, CBO projected growth of 2.2 and 1.7% in 2018 and 2019, respectively. After enactment of TCJA, actual growth in those years were 3.0 and 2.6%. CBO assumes that the TCJA tax cuts will expire in their projections. This pessimistic projection for the next 10 years reflects current law assumptions that this budget would provide the means to amend. And we are using real numbers. Since the end of World War II, economic growth has averaged 3.2%, and since 2010, economic growth has averaged 2.6%. That's the number that we put in this budget. There's no 3% growth projection in this budget, as the gentleman contends. Our budget's growth assumption is in line with the long-term and short-term historical record and defends itself by providing for pro-growth policies like tax cuts for all Americans and a reduction of regulations to strengthen American businesses. In President Trump's first term, excluding the distorting effects of the COVID pandemic, economic growth averaged 2.7%. This fact was well understood by the American people when they elected President Trump a second time last November, and the period of growth may be attained again and sustained through the 10 years with the policies provided for in this budget. Removing the macroeconomic feedback in this budget, as this amendment proposes, would ignore our economy's historical record and the positive effects of the pro-growth policies contained within this budget. The assertion that this amendment purports that the economic policies of the budget would negatively affect American workers and the economy is ridiculous. It ignores the results of the previous pro-growth reforms in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. After enactment of the TCJA, more than 6 million people were lifted out of poverty. The poverty rate dropped to the lowest level in U.S. history. Income and wealth inequality fell after the TCJA's. Real wages for the bottom 10% grew nearly twice as fast as the top 10%, and real wealth of the bottom 50% of households rose 3 times faster than that of the top 1%. In 2018, the first year of the tax cuts being in effect, the bottom 50% of taxpayers saw their tax burden fall over 10%, 10.3%. The top 1%, who the other side is so concerned with, they saw their taxes fall only 0.04%. The economic assumptions in this budget are in line with our country's historical performance and strengthened by the policies that it provides, preventing a $4 trillion tax hike on the American people, unleashing American energy production, and reducing burdensome regulations will drive our economy to the assumptions in this budget. This amendment, unfortunately, ignores both the history and potential of our economy while relying on the faulty economic beliefs that sparked an inflationary crisis, strangled consumer finances, and exacerbated a housing shortage. So with that, I urge a no vote, and I yield back. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Peters, you have a 1-minute closing statement. Now,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You missed my mind-changing 7 minutes.
well, I just.
Thanks for the 1 minute.
I was enthralled with Mr. Klein's arguments.
Yeah,
Look, I just want to say, for the record, I do believe I'm not incorrect, that 3% is the basic growth assumption here. We just talked about that with the folks on the professional staff. So I think that is the assumption. It is the opinion of outside experts, the CBO, that is wildly optimistic, and we should just be prudent because we're making a big bet here. And again, I don't think we should talk about this reversing the TCJA as a binary thing, because you could preserve parts of it and you could change parts of it. And what I would change is, I would change the high marginal tax rate back to what it was, from 37 to 39. That's not going to ruin anybody's life. It's not going to affect our lifestyle. And the alternative is to ask, who's going to pay for it if you don't? And as we add up this deficit, we know it's our kids who are ultimately going to pay higher taxes in the form of inflation and a weaker country, if not directly in the form of higher taxes themselves. So I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. I mean,
Klein.
consent request
You bet.
to submit a congressional testimony from former Chairman Kevin Brady into the record, and